Welcome to today's colloquium. We have Dr. Olivia Kuljian, who is an assistant professor in the psychology department. Her research approaches uncertainty, intergroup relations, and dehumanization, prototypicality, and leadership through the lens of social identity theory. While she has always been interested in making people uncomfortable, her master's thesis at Cal Poly Humboldt allowed her to investigate antecedents of feeling uncomfortable or notably uncertain in social groups. Then her doctoral work at Texas Tech offered an opportunity to expand and investigate the consequences of uncertainty for individual and group behavior. Through her dissertation, Olivia explored the impact of ambiguity surrounding group qualities for members' conceptions of self-identity. Her current work continues to explore how group-level threats, such as uncertainty surrounding one's social identity, group leader, or group standing, affects how people understand themselves and others. Please welcome Olivia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and also thank you to all of you for joining me here today. I know that it is intensely beautiful outside right now, so I appreciate you sticking with me indoors with the shades drawn to listen to me talk about my research, and yeah, thank you for that. Thank you to Paul Nauert, notably, for the small bit of sunshine brought by these daffodils. So we have a little bit of outside in here. So I'm really excited to speak with you today about my research program, my current research, also my past research, and proposed future research as well too, where I'm investigating this term group prototype ambiguity. And so we'll get into what this term means, but also this set of existential questions that I like to pose, especially given the content of this talk today. So my work mostly focuses on the social identity theory approach, wherein we understand that our self-identity is heavily structured by our group memberships. So we often turn to our social groups to gain a better understanding of who we are, to reduce our self-uncertainty, and also to know how to think, act, and behave in a given situation. But a couple of questions might arise on occasion within our social group context. Notably, who are we? When this question comes up, this is really concerning. This sparks some concern about what it means to be a group member. And there are some consequences when we ask this question, when we're uncertain about who we are as group members. Notably, this can cause some uncertainty about who am I, or who we are as individuals, and our own specific individual identity, which is heavily tied to this social group identity. So when we have a lack of clarity, ambiguity around this overarching group membership, we have consequences for individual identity construction. So throughout this talk today, I've kind of broken it down into a few different directions. So first, I'd like to provide us with a broad overview of these group processes that are at play that really shape identity and also motivate our actions that we take. And I've got a couple of pieces of work to speak to this. A recently published chapter with my collaborator that speaks to how threats to our understanding of ourselves as group members can shape group behavior. And following that conceptual theoretical work, also some empirical research. Who are we if we do not know who our leader is? Understanding the role of leaders in identifying this overarching definition of what it means to be a group member, and what happens when we no longer have that representative leadership. From there, I'm going to move into the central theme of today's talk, group prototype ambiguity. And I'm going to be talking about my dissertation research, which also posed this question, who are we, who am I? And also some relevant student research projects that continue this line of work and continue to expand this. I'll also talk about some of the limitations that we seem to be noticing again and again within this work, notably the need for a new scale, a new measure of prototype ambiguity, and also some manipulations of prototype ambiguity too, to allow us to experimentally test these effects. So that's going to be outlined under the current and future work directions. Now, starting first with group processes that shape identity and motivate action. Now, people understand their identity through group memberships, according to the social identity theory approach. When we understand ourselves as group members, we self-categorize as group members, and we start to view the world along these categorical boundary lines and conditions about who's in our in-group, who's in social outgroups, and what describes what groups we belong to versus what groups other people belong to. When we start to see the world according to these categorical group boundaries, we're depersonalizing and starting to view and interpret and evaluate both ourselves and others according to these essential qualities and attributes that bring definition to these groups themselves. So these essential qualities, these fuzzy sets of norms and essential attributes truly are termed group prototypes. And this is going to be a term that I'll be using again and again. So these group prototypes and the groups themselves provide us with a lot of benefits. When we have a clear understanding of who we are as group members, and also a clearly accessible group prototype from which to structure our understanding of ourselves as group members, we're able to make sense of our complex social world. We are allowed to maybe predict how other people might behave based on the content of their group prototypes and the expectations for their group behavior. We also can gain a sense of a shared reality, a validation of our own worldview, because we look to other people within our social group and we all share this same prototype that's shaping our values, our belief systems too. And all of this coupled as well with these prescribed definitions for how exactly we should think, act, behave, vote as individual group members coming together provides us with some uncertainty reduction too. We're able to establish a really clear understanding of our identity as group members. Now, this uncertainty is really key to this equation here, and it's something that we often strive to reduce in multiple areas and domains within our life. Uncertainty can be extremely uncomfortable, and because it's very aversive, especially when it's in relation to ourselves, our social standing, our capabilities, it's very motivating. And so people are often motivated to reduce this uncertainty, and uncertainty identity theory describes that one of the best ways that we can reduce this self-uncertainty is through our identification with a social group. Again, when we identify with a social group, when we view ourselves as that group member and we look to this group prototype, we're able to establish a really clear understanding of exactly what we should be doing at a given time, what we should be believing, what we should be thinking about. So in this sense, these group prototypes are really valuable for prescribing really clear definitions of self-identity for members. But some bad news, I hate to break it to you, not everyone is going to be near and close to this group prototype. As we may have personally experienced or witnessed across social groups, members are going to vary in terms of how close, how proximal they are to these group prototypes. And the closer you are to a group prototype, the more central of a group member you might be, the better, typically. Because when you're close to that in-group prototype, you're allowed this really clear guideline for which to construct your self-identity and reduce uncertainty. But when you're not clear to the in-group prototype, when you're on the periphery of a group, when you're non-prototypical, as it's termed, this is really uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable because you're not only distant from these idealized qualities of group membership, what you should be striving for, how you can understand your identity, but you might also be more proximal to icky outgroups and their group prototypes too. So when people are non-prototypical in a social group, they're unable to reference this group prototype to establish a clear definition of self-identity. And previous research has demonstrated that this contributes to self-identity insecurity and also self-uncertainty too. And because this is so, and I'm sorry to use the word again, icky feeling, right? People are often motivated to reduce feeling non-prototypical, to become more prototypical within their social groups. And so they're motivated to engage in a variety of different group behavior designed at increasing their prototypical group status. So a bulk of research has spoken to this, including Jet et al.'s work that has described that people often engage in pro-in-group behavior when they feel non-prototypical of a group. But Homan and colleagues' work really demonstrated that at the root of this feeling non-prototypical and why this is motivating group behavior, the root of this is uncertainty. So when we feel non-prototypical in a social group, this is promoting feelings of self-uncertainty, and it's this motivating aspect of self-uncertainty that's really driving a lot of these actions to restore prototypical status, to restore a clear sense of self-identity. So some of the actions that people can take that I summarized briefly in the chapter include identification with social groups. So again, one of the best ways to reduce uncertainty is by increasing in-group identification. And this is a meta-analysis by Choi and Hogg demonstrating that over and over, again and again in the literature, we see this effect strongly pop up. People also tend to bolster really strong and prominent identities, including national identities, and they also increase their identification with highly entitative groups. Now, this is a jargon term. Entitative essentially just means really groupy groups. Groups that tell you exactly who you are as a member, what it means to be a member. They have really clear guidelines for membership, descriptions of who's in the group, who's out of the group, and exactly what you should be doing as a group member. So that sounds all well and good, right? Yes, but some of these highly entitative or groupy groups also tend to be very radicalist or extreme groups. So we see research supporting that when people feel really uncertain, they also tend to be attracted towards these groups that are telling them exactly who they are and how to feel, how to vote, what they should be doing. But other than just simply identifying with different groups, people also are motivated to engage in actions to bolster their identification or their identity with an existing group too. So additional work demonstrates that when people are made to feel self-uncertain, they attempt to promote their own in-group. They tend to promote the entitativity of their in-group. And with entitativity, again, we're trying to establish and make firm these guidelines for group membership, what it means to be a group member. One way to do that is to derogate people who are not showcasing what it means to be a group member. So people who are deviating or dissenting from the social norms of your in-group, you may be motivated to derogate those members. So some really interesting work summarized here showcases that when people feel self-uncertain by way of feeling non-prototypical in their in-group, they're motivated to derogate other non-prototypical group members. As well, we see evidence to suggest that people who are uncertain want their in-group to polarize away from relevant out-groups. And this really serves to structure and shape and really clearly define what it means to be an in-group member by this established contrast away from out-groups. And this can be done in the way of supporting extreme messaging too, or even autocratic leadership. Now, in addition, we see a bulk of research continuing to support that when people are made to feel uncertain, they engage in pro-in-group behavior, again, in an attempt to really establish clarity to this in-group identity and who they are within this in-group as a valued member. But some additional recent research has also started to indicate that people may also be motivated to engage in more extreme forms of group behavior. And so to summarize just really quickly this bulk of research here, we see that uncertainty about one's own group status, as well as the clarity of those group qualities themselves, motivates action to reduce that uncertainty. We've seen this by way of support for extremist groups, autocratic leaders, polarization, and even extreme behaviors that include intentions to self-sacrifice oneself. Now, given these really extreme consequences that we can already start to think about for intergroup relations, outgroup perceptions, and also even personal well-being too, it's really important and valuable to investigate the antecedents of feeling uncertain and how we can reduce that. So I had an opportunity to investigate one such antecedent within a recent study with my collaborators that saddled the 2020 American presidential election. So in this, we were investigating the consequences for political identity and members' self-uncertainty following an election loss, which should pose some concerns for that group identity of your political group. Now, following an election loss, we experience a loss of a political figurehead typically. And this can have consequences for understanding what it means to be a group member. When we no longer have somebody representing and telling us exactly who we are as group members, this can have some consequences for the clarity of this group prototype. So to speak a little bit more about the value of leaders within our social groups, there's a bulk of evidence to suggest that leaders have this intense power to not only exemplify and represent the group prototype, but also this power to shape and shift and influence the group prototype. And due to this intense power, they're often this huge source of influence within social groups, and followers look to them for an understanding of the current status of the group prototype. We also see within leadership research kind of a winning-losing effect too. So when leaders rise in status, for example, winning an election, followers often view them as more prototypical. But when they experience a fall in status, for instance, losing an election, followers often seem to view them as less prototypical. And this has consequences for the followers' own conceptions of self-identity, as we hypothesized. Without this clear representation of what the group prototype currently is, this can have consequences for, again, this group-level prototype clarity, and also from that, members' own ability to draw understandings of self-identity conception from this group prototype. So given the outcome of the election, we hypothesized that Republicans would view their political leader, Donald Trump, as lower in prototypicality relating to that political group. We also believe that this would have consequences for followers' own understanding of their identity. So we felt that this would relate to lowered perceptions of self-prototypicality, as followers are really struggling to grasp a clear understanding of what that group prototype is. And as established in previous research, this lowered self-prototypicality should have consequences for increased self-uncertainty. So for our first study, we had an opportunity to survey 248 participants from Amazon Mechanical Turk. We had 166 Democrats and 82 Republicans. And they answered questionnaires and survey items designed to assess leader prototypicality, self-prototypicality, and self-uncertainty. And we see here a serial mediation model that generates support for our hypothesis. So to walk through step by step and pathway by pathway of this model, we see that for Republicans, after the election, they viewed their political leader as lower in prototypicality of their group. This perception of lower leader prototypicality had consequences for lowered self-prototypicality. And as expected, especially with previous work, this related to increased self-uncertainty. Now, to make sure that this wasn't just a fluke in the data, we conducted a second study that was running simultaneously at the same time with a slightly larger participant sample pool, 514, and a little bit of a more even distribution of Democrats and Republicans here. Also, this was being collected at a slightly different time frame, and also through a different service, RexDirect. And also of interest, we asked participants to indicate their perceptions of the same constructs, but we measured these constructs using different measures. We found a conceptual replication for our results in the first study. Again, looking at these same pathways, we see evidence that once again, Republicans are viewing their political leader as less prototypical. This in turn relates to lowered self-prototypicality, which relates to increased self-uncertainty. So I think that this finding was particularly interesting, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it even after publication, because it was so curious to me how we have these group level qualities, or the lack thereof, the loss of a representative political leader, and how that can have such severe implications and consequences for conception of one's own identity. And so that turned to be the focus of my dissertation research that we'll get to in this next section about group prototype ambiguity. So as we've seen in that last work presented, the clarity of a group prototype is not something that's static. It's something that can really shift, for instance, in the context of a political election. And we see groups that naturally vary in terms of prototype ambiguity, or in other words, this ambiguous definition of group membership, what it means to be a group member. So cults, gangs, and fraternities, these groups that are maybe highly entitative too, and often prescribe really clear definitions for what it means to be a group member, these are groups that are low in this prototype ambiguity. But other groups, perhaps groups that have just been made, minimal groups for instance, or groups that maybe experienced a loss in a political election, might be higher in prototype ambiguity. And this should have differential consequences for their followers. So groups that have low prototype ambiguity are providing members, again, with a really clear idea of what it means to be a group member, and thus equipping their members with tools necessary to reduce self-uncertainty, to tell you exactly who you are. But on the other hand, these groups that have high prototype ambiguity are providing a very ambiguous description of what it means to be a group member and are not equipping members with those same tools needed to reduce self-uncertainty and understand identity. So these groups that are high in prototype ambiguity often hinder the construction of a group-referenced identity. Members, again, as we discussed previously, are unable to reference this group prototype to establish a clear sense of self-identity. And so I predicted that this would have consequences, again, for members' self-prototypicality. It should relate to lowered perceptions of self-prototypicality, in turn relating to increased perceptions of self-uncertainty. And I believe that if this was a group that was really valuable, really, really important to members, that they might be motivated by this self-uncertainty to alleviate this lack of clarity of this overarching group for the attributes of that group, for instance. So if this group is really important to folks, I predicted that they might engage in increased identification motives and actions, maybe even some extreme behavior to go to bat for their group and redefine the clarity of that group prototype. So to test this, I recruited 425 participants from Cloud Research. Participants completed measures of in-group importance, in-group prototype ambiguity that involves a written prompt wherein participants are asked to report and describe what they believe the in-group prototype is, and then answer a few different questions about how easy that was for them to do, how confident they are, and what they thought, the percentage that they thought of other group members would agree with that description too. We'll talk more about this measure in a little bit. They also completed measures of self-prototypicality and self-uncertainty, and also this really interesting extreme measure called fight or die intentions, essentially their intentions to fight or die for their in-group. And this includes extreme items such as, I would sacrifice my life if it saved another Democrat's life. So again, this measure really illustrates some of these extreme behavioral intentions that people might endorse if they're willing to go to bat for their in-group and redefine clarity to that group. So here is the hypothesized moderated serial mediation model, and there is support for the hypotheses at average and 1 standard deviation above average levels of group importance. So to walk us through this model, for people who believe that their in-group is important to them or very important to them, when they experience prototype ambiguity of this group, they feel less prototypical within that group. This drop in self-prototypicality was related to increased self-uncertainty. And again, for people who viewed this in-group as very important, this increased self-uncertainty motivated increased intentions to fight or die for their in-group. So we see some of this extreme behavioral intentions coming to play as people are attempting to redefine the clarity to this in-group. Now, I've had an opportunity to expand on this research with some different student research projects, and I brought a couple of notes with me to make sure that I don't leave out any details about them. This first project, Kirkpatrick and Kuljian, investigated how lowered perceptions of one's own leader prototypicality contributed to increased perceived prototype ambiguity of a social group, really showcasing the power that leaders have to define and bring clarity or not to our group level attributes. And then this also had consequences for lowered self-prototypicality too. So this work really established that kind of hidden link of the earlier election study. This was expanded on in a currently in-press article with the EOU Science Journal that demonstrated that lowered leader prototypicality also related to increased prototype ambiguity, which then also increased self-uncertainty, and this had consequences for how warm people viewed outgroup members. In fact, when they felt more self-uncertain due to this increased prototype ambiguity, they actually lowered their perceptions of the warmth of outgroup members, demonstrating a form of derogation. And Thomas and colleagues also found that leader voice, a related variable to leader prototypicality, essentially just describing a leader's ability to represent and define an in-group. When there were concerns about leader voice, that increased prototype ambiguity as well, and also had consequences for increased self-uncertainty. And then through a series of projects by Langdon and presented at multiple different outlets, this demonstrated that when people feel these threats to self-prototypicality and threats to self-uncertainty, that again, this does contribute across multiple studies to increased intentions to fight or die for one's in-group. So collectively across this research, we ended up coming up again and again to kind of the same concerns that we had about measuring and assessing prototype ambiguity. And while there was an established measure of prototype ambiguity, there were no manipulations to date that specifically spoke to the manipulation of specifically prototype ambiguity. So this defines our current and future work, both in the lab and also within my program of research, to develop a new measure of prototype ambiguity, one that will speak to all dimensions of what a prototype theoretically entails based on a literature review. So here's the existing measure, and I'd like to spend a minute to go into more depth with this measure. So this measure asks people to consider the unique values and qualities that characterizes your in-group and sets it apart from other groups, the norms, attitudes, goals, beliefs, customs, behavior, reputation, etc. Please describe these qualities of your in-group in the space below in no more than 5 sentences. After participants have completed this brief essay response, they're asked to answer 3 questions on varying scales. How difficult was it to generate this description of your in-group? How confident are you that this is an accurate description? And a degree of consensus here. What percentage of other in-group members do you think would agree with this description? And they move a sliding scale from 0 to 100. So from a psychometric point of view, I'm a little bit concerned about the varying scales of these different items. From a research perspective, I'm also concerned that people are not going to be fully devoting themselves to an essay-style prompt within survey research. And also consistently across at least the research that I've done with this scale has never reached a Cronbach's alpha of above 0.8. So it has never truly been very good with internal consistency, which is a point of concern as well too. And also from a theoretical perspective, I'm concerned that the questions asked here don't necessarily key into all of the theoretical elements of what a prototype is and how we can understand whether a prototype of our in-group is clear or lacking in clarity, ambiguous. So this describes our attempts in this next work to identify these different subdomains of group prototypes. So over the summer last year, I had an opportunity with my collaborators to really dive into the literature in more depth and understand and develop a summary of the literature in terms of what a prototype is and what domains we saw continuing to pop up again and again, defining what a prototype is within our literature. So we've developed these different subdomains of group prototypes that we're including within our measure. So these include descriptive information. Prototypes should describe what members should be doing or are doing within a given situation, are doing. Prescriptive information describes this ideal form of behavior that members should strive for within a social group. We also have consensus among members, this degree that everybody is kind of clear on this understanding of what it means to be a group member, and also this aspect of distinctiveness too. How is our in-group distinct from social outgroups? What are the qualities of our in-group that really set us apart from social outgroups too? So with these 4 domains, we set out to develop items, and we also wanted to include a degree of the ABCs of social psychology. If you're familiar with that term, that's investigating the affect, behavior, and cognitions that people experience in different social processes. So you'll see with the items that I'm going to show you next that these are attempting to speak to these different ABCs. The behaviors, the beliefs, the values, and even the feelings that people feel when thinking about each of these subdomains of what a prototype is, how clear or ambiguous their group prototype is. Now, I want to preface the feeling or the emotional component with some degree of caution. This isn't always represented within the theorizations of discussions of group prototypes, and we'll see a little bit of concern perhaps with the emotional items. So just a heads up. So for descriptive information, participants were asked to indicate their agreement or disagreement to the following statements about how people in their in-group tended to operate. So here are some example items or the full items. It is clear how Americans tend to behave, what they tend to believe, what they tend to value, and what they tend to feel. Now with prescriptive, it's more about this ought to behave, ought to value, ought to believe, ought to feel. Consensus, these items again get to this degree about how other people in an in-group, for example Americans, tend to agree on what Americans are generally like, how they ought to be, what it means to be an American, and what emotional states they tend to share. And lastly, with distinctiveness, this includes items. Americans are distinct from citizens of other countries, again getting at this comparison between one's in-group and out-group, that they're separate from the out-group, that there is a clear understanding of what it means to be uniquely American, and also that their emotional states are different and distinct. So here's the plan of analysis. Whenever investigating a new measure or a measure of a construct, you want to assess the validity and reliability. So to assess the construct validity of this proposed measure, we wanted to investigate the internal structure to see if the items are falling in a pathway and relating to the scale in the expected manner, with these subdomains of prototype ambiguity also relating to this overarching latent variable domain of prototype ambiguity. This also would allow an opportunity to identify weak items. Maybe those emotional items might be ones to consider too here. Also, with validity, I wanted to investigate convergent, discriminant, and criterion validity. So convergent validity essentially describes that if your measure is really tapping into the construct that you think it is, then it should relate to measures of other related constructs to that original construct. So some of the related constructs include prototype, the existing measure of prototype ambiguity. We should expect somewhat strong correlations, or at least moderate, as well with a construct termed identity ambiguity, group uncertainty, social identity uncertainty, and entitativity. So we collected data on each of these measures in the hopes of comparing them to the created measure. Now, while your measure should ideally be closely related to measures of constructs that are related, it should also not really be related to unrelated measures of constructs, right? So that's why social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism were included. These should not be as closely related to our measure if it's really tapping into what we think it is. And also, this measure should perform in a way that is expected. If this measure is truly measuring prototype ambiguity, then it should relate to lowered self-prototypicality and increased self-uncertainty. And so this is defining and establishing criterion validity. Also, to investigate reliability, we wanted to look at Cronbach's alpha for internal consistency, and also to see how this model replicated across multiple studies. So with study 1, we had an opportunity to recruit 436 participants from Prolific, and also for study 2, 316 participants from Cloud Research, and all present these results simultaneously for each of these assessments of the psychometric properties of the proposed measure. So this is a lot of stats on this page, my apologies, but I would like to point your attention to the first bolded value. This is just representing the Cronbach's alpha of the created measure and also of all the other measures too, this assessment of internal consistency. It's at 0.92 or 0.93 across all of the different studies. Across both studies, and each study had 2 rounds of data collection, again saddling another election because I like to do that. One thing that I want to point out as well in addition to this is the value directly below the bolded value. That is the value referring to the measure, the existing measure of prototype ambiguity. It still is not reaching a Cronbach's alpha of above 0.80, demonstrating again this need for a more internally consistent measure. So that's a good sign. Moving on to construct validity, I wanted to assess a few different models of this measure. And so with construct validity, we're looking to see how this measure fits together, how the items within this measure fit together, and we're using a few different parameters to judge this fit. So this first parameter here, this is chi-squared. Generally, you want to see this number go down, put simply, and that's going to be indicating better fit of the model. CFI, you want to see that number approximate 1. And RMSEA, you want to see that number also go down quite as much as possible too. That's all put simply. So first, I wanted to evaluate what the fit of the model was like if I just threw in all of the items under a single factor, one latent variable of prototype ambiguity, not even thinking about the subdomains at all. This was a decent fit, but it wasn't that great, to be honest. Once we added in those subdomains into the model, the fit improved dramatically. And it's actually a reasonable, decent fit that could be kind of good enough, as one would say, in terms of developing the measure. We also tested, just out of curiosity, what happened if we removed the emotion items from each of the domains, because those, again, are coming up to be a little bit of concern. We see that the model improves across these three parameters, improves again, but it's still just improving slightly at this point. So really, it seems the key is to have these predicted subdomains where each of these items are going into each of their subdomains first before that overarching latent variable of prototype ambiguity. And the same pattern of results exists again for the post-election findings within study 1 and also across both pre-election and post-election for study 2 as well. Now, plugging everything into this proposed model, which looks like multiple spiders to me all coming together, we see that when items are allowed to fit within the subdomains that they're assigned and then also into this overarching latent variable, that the individual item loadings are looking pretty good for each of the items. They do seem to be weaker for some of the items like item 12 and item 16, which are speaking again to the emotional component of each of these subdomains. But overall, they look pretty good. We see this evidence of this for the study 1 pre-election data, same pattern of results for the study 1 post-election data, those same weak items kind of popping out. And again, with the item loadings, I'm looking at the values that are within the boxes. The values below without the boxes are the variances. And the same pattern of results once again for study 2, both pre-election and post-election. And what's interesting is that across each of these studies and the data collection efforts, the same items are kind of popping up that could be deemed as slightly problematic. So that will definitely inform our choices for which items to retain versus perhaps which items to remove. Here we have a couple of tables about the correlations, the bivariate correlations between the measures included within these studies. And this can really give us some insights about, again, the convergent and discriminant validity of the measure. So we see with the new prototype ambiguity measure that there are pretty good moderate to strong, semi-strong correlations between related or measures of related constructs, especially anteditivity. And this is really valuable too because prototype ambiguity or prototype clarity should inform and heavily relate to understandings of a group's entitativity. The more clear your group prototype is, the more entitative you're probably going to feel that group is. So we see in study 1 an understanding and some evidence speaking towards this convergent validity with the new measure. Same with study 2. And study 2 also adds measures of social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism. Remember, these are our discriminant measures. We did not want them to be related, if even, to the created measure of prototype ambiguity. And the results support that this measure is not as related to social dominance orientation or right-wing authoritarianism. The correlations are weak, if even significant. And in addition, a couple of regressions displayed here across study 1 and study 2 speaking to criterion validity. So here we have expectations that, again, our measure of prototype ambiguity should negatively relate to self-prototypicality and positively relate to self-uncertainty. We see across both studies and both rounds of data collection within each study that, again, increased prototype ambiguity according to this created measure is relating to decreased self-prototypicality and also increased self-uncertainty. So it's performing in the way that we would expect with relevant variables too. Now, turning the page to some of the future work that I'm developing, and if we have time, I can briefly run through these at the end. I'm developing a visual infographic to manipulate Prototype ambiguity. Essentially, this will provide people with a series of statistics designed to make them feel that their group prototype is either very clear or that people might feel that it's really unclear. I also have an AI-generated image saying that we had people create this composite image through AI. The clarity of the image should speak to the clarity of the group prototype in essence, and we provide either a very clear image or a very murky AI-generated image. We also have a memory task in which people are just asked to recall either 20 aspects of their in-group prototype or 4 aspects of their in-group prototype. 4 should be significantly easier, right? But the cognitive difficulty associated with recalling 20 should cause people to interpret that, well, because I'm having difficulty with this, maybe it's not as clear as I originally thought, right? And so the hope with that manipulation design is that it will prompt increased feelings of prototype ambiguity. We also have a writing task inspired by a previous uncertainty writing prime 2, which essentially asks people to describe aspects of their group prototype that are clear or that are unclear, and also a questionnaire wherein people are asked to indicate their agreement or disagreement to various items describing their in-group prototype clarity in some sense, but there's a slight wording change. In one condition, they're asked to describe their agreement to items that use the word sometimes, which is much easier to endorse versus always, right? Especially when you're speaking about large in-groups. Americans always do this, for instance, versus Americans sometimes do this. And again, due to this perceived difficulty in endorsing these always statements, that's designed to also promote an uncertainty about the group prototype clarity. So those are the manipulations currently in testing. Depending on this pilot data, I may need to collect some additional pilot data just to be sure about which one is the most effective. Or if all looks good, I'm excited to hopefully start some experiments where I can experimentally manipulate prototype ambiguity and evaluate different aspects and outcomes for self-identity conception. And so this identifies and defines my goals for future research as well. So with future research, again, I'm really excited to start using these manipulations if at least one turns out, and experimentally examine the consequences of prototype ambiguity, especially when we're talking about consequences for self-prototypicality and self-uncertainty, and also how this impacts consequences for identity construction, and what people will engage in when they're attempting to reestablish the clarity of both their individual identity, but also this overarching group identity too. So I'm interested to explore the tactics that people might use in an attempt to reestablish this group clarity. Perhaps they might, according to previous research, engage in some sort of projection in which they project aspects of their own identity onto the stage of their group identity to try to reestablish that clarity, and what are the outcomes of that. I'm also interested in as well into some of the additional actions that people might take in attempt to restore clarity to this group prototype. So we've seen some initial evidence, correlational research here, right, describing that people might engage in pro-group behavior to try to reestablish that group identity. But I'm also interested in some of this extreme actions that people might take or be willing to take, including support for extremist leadership, if they believe that taking those extreme actions, supporting that extremist leadership, might allow them to reestablish that group prototype and the clarity to that group prototype. With that, these are my references. Sorry for the small font. Before we go to questions, I just want to give a huge thank you again to all of you in this room and listening online too, and watching online, for taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about all this research. I want to thank my collaborators as well, also my undergraduate research assistants who have been continuing to conduct this work. It's allowed for a really in-depth exploration of a lot of these variables, and it's really cool to see how all of these variables continue to relate and play out. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Wow. Do we have any questions?
Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Kuljian. I always learn so much from your talks. and always generates so many questions for me. So I have a couple to throw at you.
Sure.
Feel free to address any or none of them if there are poor questions. So first question, I'm very curious, what about the interaction of different group identities? I am an American. I'm also, if I'm a dual citizen, I'm Canadian, or I'm a member of this party, or whatever. How do those interact, and especially power struggle over some sort of superordinate identity? And political party and the national identity is, all over your research, of course. And then second, I would be curious to hear, and I'm sure ignorant, I know I'm ignorant of the literature, but would love to hear your view on what the literature has to say about how culture mediates our conception of the importance of prototypicality. To make a sweeping statement as an Americanist and as an American, I'd say Americans often say that we value individualism, a sort of like Emersonian ideal. So in a culture that celebrates, I'm an individual, I'm an independent voter, I'm neither. I mean, is that a type of prototype, just the dissident or the independent thinker? So that, is there any escape from this by the path of culture? Are we always just social primates?
There's no escape, right?
Thank you.
So great questions. Speaking to your first one about this interplay of multiple identities, we're complex beings, right? We don't all have one singular identity. We leave work on occasion and go home to the rest of our lives, or we have other social identities at play. But a lot of this work really speaks to this, the most salient identity at a given time. And another thing I wanted to say about that too is when we might feel concern about one identity, we might drop it, to be honest. So the meta-analysis that I introduced earlier by Choi and Hogg that spoke about this overarching finding across literature again and again popping up that when we feel self-uncertain, we want to identify with our social groups. That is consistently found again and again, except when that social group is the cause of self-uncertainty. So I really appreciate your question because it allows to also demonstrate why this expansion is important to this work too. Prototype ambiguity is a form of uncertainty threat at the group level. But why is it inspiring increased identification among followers and increased intentions to fight or die for one's in-group? Well, it has to do with how important and maybe central and valuable that group identity is to us. So if a group is causing us strife and uncertainty within ourselves, sure, we might drop it. We might focus on other identities that are more salient, more valuable to us, more certainty inspiring and ability to define our social identity. But in some instances, like we've seen here with political identities, this really central, important identity to many people, uncertainty coming from that group identity actually has inspired attempts to satiate that certainty at the group level to then allow it to be satiated at the individual level. And could you, your second question was about the role of culture within promoting strivings to be close to the in-group prototype. Is that?
We fancy ourselves individuals.
Yeah.
So, and maybe phrased differently, can the rejection of the aspiration of prototypicality in a group be a type of prototypicality, especially in a culture where you're taught that that is a good thing? I am a rugged individual. I am an independent thinker. I. Or is that all just a sort of like narrative that a individualistic culture tells itself?
So I think there's a really great South Park episode to reference and describe this, and I'm not even joking, but if people can help recall my memory, there's a school group of kids who like to wear all black a lot and describe themselves as being outside of popular culture and not like the other kids. Is that recalling any memories? Okay, cool. So it's not a false memory on my end. So they're promoting this idea that they're not like everybody else, they're separate, they're unique and distinct, and that is still describing these motivations that we carry within our social group memberships. So this is kind of speaking to some different theories about why we are motivated to join social groups. It's because social groups allow us to satiate these almost competing desires to be part of something, but also unique and distinct. So there's multiple work that continues to echo this kind of interesting desires that we have to not only feel that we belong, but also to feel that we are unique too. And being in a social group membership, especially one that allows you to feel like you're on the outskirts of society, that you're individualistic, that you're independent, allows you to satiate that desire to be distinct and also unique, but also provides you with that sense of belongingness too. Yeah, so I have a lot to say on that.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Someone else?
Yeah, I'm on. Hey, I really enjoyed that, and I don't have as deep a questions as Paul. So I was thinking about this in terms of my field, and I think maybe I have a relatively rudimentary understanding of groups, right? But I'm thinking about if we identify as an exercise group versus a sedentary group, right? Let's say as two different social groups. By understanding the prototype of a group and how a person identifies with that prototype, can we use that then to change behavior so a person can move from one group to another? And I'm thinking of taking the group of low exercise sedentary individuals. If they identify with that group, but we can find the right trigger to get them to change the perception of their prototype to move to the exercise group, so now that they start to engage in healthy behavior. Does this speak to that in some way?
I think so. I've have some thoughts popping up that I want to hear your thoughts on too. So with the sedentary group, just guessing, I feel like not a whole lot of people identify strongly with that group, because to me it doesn't seem to be a group with very rigid or strong guidelines for what it means to be a group member. That's just something that we can all kind of engage in, and it's also not something that people may want to promote about themselves unless you're like in a couch potato club and you really value that club membership or something. But for the most part, I would say that sedimentary groups are very low in entitativity or groupiness, right? Because it doesn't have clearly constructed guidelines. But from taking an outside perspective to look in at high exercise groups, those groups might have more clarified guidelines for what it means to be a group member and expectations. You have to meet kind of a baseline typically for exercise behavior. Or it may be interpreted that you have to hit maybe a really high baseline to be considered part of the exercise group, right? One way or strategy that I could immediately think about encouraging people to leave the couch potato club or this like unclarified sedentary lifestyle to enter more exercise lifestyles could be to reduce the perceived barriers into that exercise group, describe that it's not really a highly entitative group. It's not a group that you have to pass an initiation for or something like that, or do something extreme to be able to join that identity. Anyone can join, and the door is open to everyone. And then, once you're in the group, you become more likely to align with the norms of that specific group just by virtue of strengthening identity. And once you're already kind of in an exercise group, you might find yourself engaging in more exercise relevant behaviors, parking a little bit further away, for instance, or engaging in other beneficial behavior. Yeah.
You kind of touched on it. I'm curious about groups that are maybe exclusive versus groups that are like always recruiting. Is that implicit in there and I just don't understand it, or is that something completely different?
Could you give me an example of like a group that's exclusive? Because I kind of feel that even groups that are exclusive are still kind of always recruiting, but they're doing so in a different way by this perception of
so maybe like think back to some of the schools or the TV shows about high schools and the cliques that are very hard to get into.
Going to come up eventually.
Right. Okay. You know, cliques that are very hard to get into versus other groups that are very easy to get into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that could be an interesting thing to discuss about like how those groups are perceived within a status hierarchy too. Like typically there's this perception that these are really elusive to be attained groups, right? And so with that like coveted group membership, people are still trying to obtain group membership, but it's more difficult. than maybe a group with less stringent boundaries or conditions. Yeah. There is some interesting research, though, that since you asked, I'm going to bother you with. There's some work that describes that groups that provide kind of an initial rejection, almost like an initiation, or Fight Club. I'm not going to spoil Fight Club to the extent. You should have watched it by now, I must say. Wherein people are needing to stand on a front porch for 3 days before they're allowed entry to with this group. That initial rejection from a group, followed by this promise of potential acceptance, strengthens identification with that group more so than just initial acceptance all the way. So there is some power to these rituals that groups engage in, these initiations. Hazing, too, seems to be kind of a continued practice in a lot of universities, unfortunately, or Fight Club, as we've seen it.
So how about a group that does that differ from one that is just always
I would say that a group that does that is going to be more entitative. It's going to prescribe more clear guidelines for exactly who you are and what you should be doing, rather than a group that is more like porous in terms of its group membership. Yeah. Good question. Sorry it took me a while to get there.
Do we have another question?
Thank you, Olivia. That was really, really good, and I learned a lot. Thanks so much. My question is with this increased understanding of uncertainty, self-identity, group identity, is there ways within that we could, with this increased understanding, change behaviors, like, of certain groups? So I'm kind of going off of Dudo's question. I don't think there's really people that maybe identify as I'm sedentary, but I go home to Wyoming and my cousin's like, I don't run. Like, I'm not doing that. Like, I don't eat green things. So there is this identity of like, you do that weird stuff, I'm gonna ride my motorcycle. Like, so there, and I'm not saying that he needs to change his behaviors, but I'm just thinking on a community-wide level, with this increased understanding of how people function in a group and as individuals, can we look at that for interventions to change behaviors in some certain circumstances?
Yeah, and I think you really highlighted the importance of identifying the intergroup context too. And so that gets into some keys about why this distinctiveness subdomain was so important for us to include in our measure of prototype ambiguity. Because so much of our understanding about who we are as group members and also what we should be doing is developed in contrast to what a relevant social outgroup is doing. You gave a great example with your cousin, right? But we also see this played out on the grand stage for all of us in the political spectrum all the time too. So whenever one party seems to adopt a position on one platform, you often see the reverse direction being adopted by the other side, even in things that should not be politicized like that, right? But I think that that just really speaks to this innate categorization processes that we carry as individuals, and also speaks to our social cognition and categorization motives. We like to categorize things by emphasizing the attributes that make those things similar within that category, and also what makes them really different from other categories. And we do that with social groups of people too. And we want to emphasize these similarities within our groups and also the distance from our social outgroups. So if there are some attempts within the literature to reduce polarization by identifying similarities, maybe defining an overarching superordinate identity that includes both subgroups under that shared sense of identity to establish new norms. There's also some work that could be put in place about providing people opportunities to interact with members of the opposing group so they can understand that this polarization that's been occurring in their mind, these emphasized differences, may not be quite as different as they proposed initially. And so having that intergroup contact is also considered to be a valuable intervention against this increasing polarization, which this polarization seems to be driving this increased adherence to group relevant and extreme behaviors too. Yeah.
Unless anyone is dying to ask one last question, we are at the end of our time. Okay.
Okay.
So I was thinking about physiology and how physiology comes in, not just the social psycho aspect of it. So let's say I am a member of the ice cream loving group, and I have low ambiguity with the prototype, but I'm lactose intolerant. So I'm willing to override my physiological distaste to be part of the group, right?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting dynamic that we would go to that extreme, like be uncomfortable to be part of a group. I think that's probably part of what happens in some of these groups, that we're willing to undergo our physiological stress but still remain part of the group, right?
Yeah, people will hold their hand in ice water longer if it's for their group identity. And there's also another side of it too that I unfortunately took out of the talk because I thought it wasn't quite relevant, but I'll bring it in now. There are benefits to our physiology by identifying with groups. So when people are made to feel self-uncertain, and then they're given the opportunity to identify with a highly entitative group that's going to tell them exactly who you are, their kind of stress responses decrease. So their heart rate decreases, and the perspiration in their palms decreases as well too. So I think for that, it's really showcasing, again, that uncertainty is a motivation, right? And it's something that's so innate that it's within our physiology as well too. When we experience an uncertainty, a discrepancy within our neighborhood, or sorry, within our environment or neighborhood, if that's your environment too, this kind of sets off an alarm system, to say, within your physiology too, that remains active until you have an opportunity to reduce that uncertainty. Yeah.
Please help me thank Dr. Kuljian for this afternoon.
Thanks.